We have this image of Canada today as this progressive, enlightened nation that is, compared to its neighbors to the south, or the rest of the North American continent for that matter, a beacon of peace, order, and good government. The terms peace, order, and good government are, in fact, enshrined in the Canadian Constitution, specifically in Section 91 of the Constitution Act of 1867, and the fruits of these values by which the Canadian government abide are apparent. For the most part, Canada reliably ranks as one of the world's least corrupt countries, and, until recently at least, also consistently boasted one of the highest standards of living and was one of the world's happiest countries. Modern Canada would largely be unrecognizable from the Canada that existed almost 200 years ago. That Canada, the Canada of the early 19th century, was instead this desperate, volatile society ruled by a few unelected elites with little regard for ordinary Canadians, who were perpetually robbed of any ability to better their lives. That was until 1837, when a series of armed uprisings would finally set the colonies on the long road to responsible government and eventual confederation. These are the rebellions of 1837 and 1838. At the start of the 19th century, Canada was not one, but two colonial entities. What we now call the province of Quebec used to be Lower Canada, with its capital of Montreal. What we now call the province of Ontario used to be Upper Canada. Its capital, York, is better known today as the city of Toronto. These two Canadas shared similar governments. They had British parliamentary systems, and each had a British ruling class. In Lower Canada, French Canadians were faced with a system deliberately stacked in favor of the province's British minority. The lower house of the Lower Canadian Parliament was the Legislative Assembly. It was directly elected by the people, while the upper house of Parliament, the Legislative Council, was instead appointed by the Governor-General, who was, in turn, appointed by the monarchy. Reflecting the province's French majority, the Legislative Assembly was typically composed of French Canadians. On the other hand, the Legislative Council would come to be dominated by the Chateau clique, a cabal of British aristocrats and merchants who had little regard for the province's French-Canadian populace. The clique regularly used its powers to block any legislation put forth by the French-dominated Assembly. This predictably wouldn't endear them to French Canadians. The clique, furthermore, sought to impose British culture. They pushed for English to replace French as the language of government, sought to replace French civil law with English common law, and sought to replace the Catholic Church with the Anglican Church. Exacerbating these constitutional issues were demographic issues as well. French Canadians were alarmed by the growing number of British and Irish immigrants who congregated mostly in cities like Montreal. French Canadians feared they would eventually be outnumbered by these foreigners, and their fears were seemingly validated in June of 1832, when an outbreak of cholera brought about by newly arrived Irish immigrants would kill thousands of French Canadians. The British had been in charge of the province's immigration policies, and so arose a conspiracy theory that the outbreak of disease had been orchestrated to cull the French population. Upper Canada had a similar situation with its government. Just like how the clique dominated the Legislative Council in Lower Canada, Upper Canada's upper house would be dominated by the Family Compact, another group of loyalist aristocrats and businessmen who used their political powers largely for their own benefit. An especially contentious issue was land. Besides controlling the Legislative Council, the Family Compact also controlled the Executive Council, the executive branch of government, which was responsible for the distribution of land. Through the Executive Council, the Compact would prioritize handing out land to wealthy speculators, as well as the Anglican Church, while ordinary Upper Canadians were typically left with scraps. And so both colonies were afflicted with the same problems: undemocratic systems, at the head of which were powerful unelected oligarchies. As the historian Crane Britton observes, any regime that engages in political patronage and prioritizes the economic interests of one demographic over all others is begging to be overthrown in revolution. Leading the charge for reform in Lower Canada was Louis-Joseph Papineau, the leader of the Parti Canadien, or the Canadian Party, later known as the Parti Patriote, or the Patriot Party. The Patriot Party was the main party representing French-Canadian interests in the Assembly. While the Assembly's powers were relatively limited, one power it had, which the Patriots took advantage of, was its control over provincial revenues. So whenever the Legislative and Executive Councils clashed with the Assembly, the Patriots simply moved to hold back funds, preventing members of either council from receiving their salaries. As a landowner, Papineau had an interest in preserving the status quo. He began his career as a moderate who admired the British parliamentary system and merely sought to reform it in Lower Canada. But year after year of frustration with the clique would eventually drive Papineau to become a Republican, pushing for full political independence from Britain. A pivotal moment for the Patriots came with their passing of the so-called 92 Resolutions. The 92 Resolutions was a long list of grievances and demands which, among many things, included the Legislative and Executive Councils be made more accountable to the people. It also demanded the Assembly have more control over how provincial revenues were used. Included in the resolutions was a subtle threat of armed revolt should the government not acquiesce to the Patriots' demands. Now, some members of the government were open to compromises with the Assembly. Archibald Aitchison, the Earl of Gosford, and the Lieutenant Government of Lower Canada had considered reforming the Executive Council to an elected body. However, London put a stop to any attempts to compromise with the Assembly, and in March 1836, Lord Gosford was ordered to take funds freely from the provincial revenues, without the Assembly's approval. This would be the final straw for the Patriots, and from then on, they began preparations for the armed uprising they had promised in the 92 Resolutions. Trouble was also brewing upriver. In Upper Canada, the main agitator for change was a reform movement, led by a fiery Scottish journalist named William Lyon Mackenzie. Mackenzie came to public attention through his newspaper, The Colonial Advocate, which he used to relentlessly attack the Family Compact. The Compact would respond with threats of legal action, libel suits, and even a direct attack on Mackenzie's newspaper's office in 1826. In what was to be called the Types Riot, vandals would break into the Advocate's office, destroy its printing presses, and dump them into Lake Ontario. Mackenzie was nonetheless popular enough to be elected as member of the Upper Canadian Legislative Assembly in 1828, then later as mayor of Toronto in 1834. Mackenzie was an admirer of the American political system. He self-identified as a Jacksonian Democrat, having met President Jackson himself in 1829. Despite his popularity, Mackenzie was always a bit of a wild card. He was often regarded as impulsive and a bit of a hothead. His opponents capitalized on his outrageous public image. The newly appointed Lieutenant Government of Upper Canada, Francis Bond Head, slammed Mackenzie as a madman. As he became more radical, he began to alienate many allies and supporters, which would cost him his bid for re-election to the Assembly in 1836. It was this loss that drove him over the edge, and it appeared that the only way to force systemic change was through armed insurrection, a sentiment he shared with the Patriots in Lower Canada. The Patriots and the Reformers were, in fact, aware of each other's struggles. Months after the rejection of the 92 Resolutions, the Patriots were in regular contact with Mackenzie, and with both groups in the midst of preparations for open rebellion, they thought to try to coordinate their plans for maximum effect. On October 23, 1837, the Patriots held a large gathering of their leaders and supporters in the small town of St. Charles, northeast of Montreal. In what is known as the Assembly of the Six Counties, the Patriots openly discussed a variety of actions they would take against the clique, from boycotting British businesses to taking up arms and marching directly in Montreal. Lord Gosford caught wind of this meeting, and 3 weeks later, on November 16, he issued arrest warrants for Papineau and the Patriot leadership under charges of treason. The rebellion in Lower Canada had begun. The government dispatched 2 armies to arrest the Patriots, who were still encamped at St. Charles and the nearby town of St. Denis. Marching on St. Charles from the north, one of the armies, under the command of General Charles Stephen Gore, was severely worn down by abysmal weather conditions before reaching Saint Denis on the 23rd. Despite being less organized and ill-equipped than their opponents, the rebels, under Wolford Nelson, would hand the exhausted government forces a resounding defeat in the opening battle of the rebellion in Lower Canada. With this triumph, one may be forgiven if they believed the Patriots would go on to win more victories. 2 days after the rebel victory at Saint Denis, the other army sent out to arrest the Patriots, under the command of General George Wetherall, arrived at St. Charles. Unfortunately for the Patriots, their victory at Saint Denis would not be replicated at the Battle of St. Charles, or in any more battles for that matter. Wetherall's forces would overwhelm the rebels under the command of Thomas Storrow Brown. 5 days later, General Gore would return with his army to Saint Denis. Despite their victory the week before, news of defeat at St. Charles had demoralized the rebels at Saint Denis, and they abandoned the town for Gore to take. With all rebel forces east of Montreal virtually defeated, government forces turned their attention west of the city. On December 14, an army would march on the rebel-occupied town of Saint Eustache. The severely outnumbered rebels, under the command of John Olivier Chenier, hoped to draw the British, commanded by General John Colborne, into close quarters fighting, where their numerical advantage might be nullified. The British responded simply by setting whichever buildings the rebels occupied on fire and shooting those who attempted to escape. Chenier himself was killed fleeing through the town's cemetery. And even before their defeat at Saint Eustache, Papineau had effectively seen the writing on the wall, and he and a few other Patriot leaders fled south to the United States. For the time being, it seemed the rebellion in Lower Canada was defeated. While the colonial government reconsolidated its hold in Lower Canada, events were well on their way in Upper Canada. With British forces drawn to the fighting downriver, Mackenzie and the reformers decided then was the time to strike. The rebellion in Upper Canada had begun. On December 5th, the reformers gathered a large group of supporters around Montgomery's Tavern, north of Toronto. There, Mackenzie declared he would march on the city, destroy any property belonging to the family compact, and hopefully incite more uprisings throughout the province. Local government forces, having been made aware of the rebellion after a small skirmish nearby, mobilized under the command of Colonel James Fitzgibbon and made their way up to the tavern. It didn't take long for Fitzgibbon's forces to overwhelm the outnumbered and outgunned rebels. The battle, which was to be known as the Battle of Montgomery's Tavern, lasted only 15 minutes, and involved Fitzgibbon's forces firing their cannons directly at the tavern, causing the terrified rebels to flee through the back exit. This would be the only significant battle in the rebellion in Upper Canada. Perhaps to Mackenzie's shock, any fervor for further violence died quickly. Like Papineau, he was forced to flee south to the United States. Not one to give up easily, the Scotsman would mount another campaign to try to regain initiative. But after occupying a small island along the Niagara River, and having one of his supply ships sunk by British cannons, Mackenzie, again, would retreat back to the States, where he would be arrested for violating Anglo-American neutrality. The Patriots, this time without Papineau, would also mount one last campaign to stir rebellion in November 1838. Having regrouped at the Forest Chasses, or the Hunter Brothers, they were bolstered by American volunteers sympathetic to the rebel cause. This second rebellion went as well as one would expect at this point, with the Hunter Brothers, led by Wolford Nelson's brother, Robert Nelson, being decisively defeated at the Battle of Odelltown. With both rebellions defeated, the rebel leaders, those who were captured anyway, were handed a variety of sentences, from death to exile to Australia. The two rebellions came mostly as a surprise to the government in London, seeking to understand the situation in the colonies and hoping to avert another rebellion. The Prime Minister appointed John Lanton, the Earl of Durham, as Governor-General of North America. Durham was tasked with investigating grievances with both Upper and Lower Canadian governments. In January of 1839, he delivered his report on the affairs of British North America, better known as the Durham Report. On the first page of the report, Durham stated, While the present state of things is allowed to last, the actual inhabitants of these provinces have no security for person or property, no enjoyment of what they possess, no stimulus to industry. Among many things, Durham recommended the unification of Upper and Lower Canada into one province, and the introduction of responsible government, in which the executive branch is accountable to a democratically elected assembly instead of the monarchy or any of its representatives. Among Canadians, the report was divisive, to say the least. In Upper Canada, whereas the report was welcomed by the reformers, it was predictably not taken well by the compact. It was especially controversial in Lower Canada. While Durham may have been somewhat sympathetic to the rebels, he was still somewhat biased against Lower Canada's French populace. Wary of French-Canadian nationalism and believing their economic hardships were a product of French culture being inherently inferior, he would recommend French Canadians be further assimilated into British culture. The primary reason for unification was to combine the British populations of both colonies so they would maintain numerical superiority over the French. In line with Durham's recommendations, the British Parliament would pass the British North America Act of 1840, also known as the Act of Union of 1840, which abolished the Upper and Lower Canadian governments and replaced them with the combined government of the province of Canada. The goal of implementing responsible government would take a bit longer to be acted upon. At first, the new province retained unelected legislative and executive councils, but by 1848, the executive council was replaced by a cabinet whose members were drawn from the legislative assembly. The resulting constitutional changes would see the family compact and the Chateau clique gradually squeezed out of power. And while their members retained much of their wealth from before the rebellions, their political influence would be diluted considerably. Much of the government's bias against French Canadians remained, as the Act of Union also removed French as the official language of the colonies. Many French Canadian leaders, including Papineau, who had been granted amnesty and allowed to return in 1849, demanded the act to be reformed or repealed entirely. Even after Canadian Confederation in 1867, French Canada's struggle against the Anglo-Canadian order would continue well into the 20th century, culminating with the rise of the modern Quebec sovereignty movement during the 1960s and 70s. Responsible government worked well enough that it was also implemented in Britain's other colonies in North America, New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, and it would even be implemented in the colonies that would make up Australia and New Zealand. On July 1st, 1867, the provinces of Canada, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia were joined through confederation to form the modern state of Canada. And over the next 100 years, more provinces and territories would join this new nation that stretches from sea to sea. From a military perspective, the rebellions of 1837 to 1838 were undeniable failures. Yet they were the impetus for change that would transform rigid colonial rule into the foundations of a modern, democratic Canada. Sometimes, the most lasting revolutions are the ones that lose on the battlefield, but win in the years that follow.